All right, let's dive in. Today, we're taking on A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn.
A book that, well, it really shakes things up, doesn't it? Turns history on its head.
Exactly. It's about the people often left out of the main narrative, those who fought for their place in the story.
The marginalized, the silenced.
Yeah, the folks whose voices don't usually make it into the textbooks. And he doesn't pull any punches. Zinn starts right off with Columbus, not the hero, but the guy who kicked off the brutal treatment of the Arawak people.
And even uses Columbus's own words. Like, let us, in the name of the Holy Trinity, go on sending all the slaves that can be sold.
Pretty jarring quote, huh? Far cry from the whole discoverer of a new world story we usually get.
It makes you wonder how much of what we were taught was, well, sugar-coated.
Right. Like, what are we missing? And the effect on the Arawak's just devastating. Zinn uses Las Casas, a priest who witnessed it all, forced labor, disease, population dropping from millions to just hundreds.
Las Casas describes them as peaceful, a rich culture, and then, well, unimaginable cruelty.
Yeah. And even though some historians debate the numbers, I mean, that level of destruction is undeniable. But Zinn also points out that other historians, like Samuel Eliot Morison, while they acknowledge what happened to the Arawaks, they kind of downplay it.
Burying the truth, as Zinn calls it. Admitting it happened, but minimizing the impact.
Okay, so let's shift to early colonial America. Zinn argues that the system of indentured servitude, brutal in itself, set the stage for reliance on African slave labor.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that Zinn initially frames it as just economics, not race. The cheapest, most controllable labor force, right?
Right, but that economic need, it morphed into a system rooted in racism, with Bacon's Rebellion as a turning point.
Right, Bacon's Rebellion.
So just to remind everyone, this was a chaotic uprising, poor whites, indentured servants, some black folks, against the elite in Virginia. How did this actually fuel racial divisions?
Well, the elite were terrified of this multiracial alliance. Imagine the power of a united working class.
Challenging their power, yeah.
So they used racial division to maintain control. It wasn't just, some inevitable prejudice. It was strategic.
Divide and conquer.
Exactly. Give poor whites a slightly higher status based on skin color, and you make sure they don't unite with black slaves against a system that's actually oppressing both groups.
This is a really crucial point. It highlights how power dynamics have shaped, the whole narrative of race in America. Are we still seeing similar tactics today, to divide folks along racial lines?
It's the question, isn't it? And it speaks to how relevant Zinn's work is. He's not just, telling us the past. He's asking us to see how these patterns show up in the present.
Okay, so on to the American Revolution. Zinn pushes back against this whole idea of a unified fight for freedom. He's pointing out the class divisions, the conflicting interests.
Yeah, he argues that, the rhetoric, liberty, equality, it's powerful, but it masked a reality where, well, many were excluded. Like, look at the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, most folks see it as the symbol of freedom.
Right, but Zinn's saying, hold on, all men are created equal. That left out women, enslaved people, indigenous people.
It was revolutionary. But for some, not for all.
Exactly.
And even after the revolution, things didn't magically become fair.
No way. Inequality was still there. Indentured servitude, slavery, still going strong. Zinn points to the regulator movement in North Carolina, poor farmers challenging corrupt officials, demanding fairer taxes.
So it wasn't just about freedom from British rule. It was about, internal injustices, power imbalances within the colonies.
Right, exactly.
And this takes us to the Constitution and the early republic.
The Constitution praised as this masterpiece of democracy, but Zinn presents it as a document designed to protect, well, the interests of the wealthy elite.
He uses Charles Beard's analysis, right? Which says that the Founding Fathers, they were driven by protecting their own economic interests.
Right. And then you have Shays' Rebellion. Farmers rising up against debt and taxes, and, well, that terrified the elite.
Realizing they needed a stronger central government to basically suppress uprisings, safeguard their power.
Exactly. Fear of the people leading to a system designed to control them. Makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah, it definitely challenges the romanticized view of the Founding Fathers and their intentions. It makes you think about how, power dynamics still shape our political systems today.
Absolutely.
And this pattern continues. Westward expansion oppression, this time targeting Native Americans and Mexicans.
The forced removal of Native American tribes, especially the Cherokee, from their lands. Broken treaties, forced marches, it's unimaginable suffering.
The Trail of Tears, a stark reminder of the brutality. But did all Native Americans just accept this fate?
Oh, absolutely not. Zinn talks about the Seminoles. They resisted fiercely, guerrilla tactics, challenging the U.S. military for years. They refused to be passive victims.
It's crucial to remember that history isn't just oppression, it's also resilience, resistance.
Absolutely. And Zinn highlights that throughout. He shows that even facing incredible odds, people fight back. They challenge the status quo. They demand justice.
And speaking of expansion, Zinn argues that the Mexican-American War, it wasn't about some noble cause. It was about greed, land, resources.
He says many Americans back then, especially abolitionists, they saw right through it. It was a land grab,
Yeah.
fueled by expanding slavery.
So manifest destiny, this justification for taking land from Mexico, not as righteous as we're led to believe.
Not at all. Zinn tears down that myth. It was imperialism, exploitation, and there was a human cost casualties from disease, the mistreatment of Mexican civilians. It was brutal.
It's easy to forget these events involved real people suffering and dying.
Zinn doesn't let us forget. He always brings it back to the human element. History is about people.
Well said. And as we go further into a people's history, it's clear Zinn doesn't just focus on the big events, the famous figures. He talks about everyday resistance, especially when it comes to slavery.
Enslaved people, despite unimaginable cruelty, they never stopped fighting for freedom.
We're talking running away, sabotaging equipment, holding onto their cultural traditions. It's resistance, even when your choices are limited.
Exactly. And think about Harriet Tubman.
Such an icon. Escaped slavery, then risked her life over and over to lead others to freedom on the Underground Railroad.
Just incredible courage. And while we hear a lot about the white abolitionist movement, Zinn reminds us that black abolitionists were central.
David Walker, for example, his Appeal, a powerful pamphlet calling for immediate emancipation, shook Southern slaveholders.
And Frederick Douglass, brilliant orator, escaped slavery, became a leading voice in the abolitionist movement.
Zinn talks about Douglas's speeches, denouncing the Fugitive Slave Act, urging resistance. This wasn't just moral persuasion, it was a challenge to the whole system.
Right. And these individuals, they were shaping history, pushing the nation towards this reckoning with its own hypocrisy. And this fight, as Zinn argues, led to the Civil War.
So ending slavery, yes, but also deeply tied to economic interests. The North, the South, they had different visions for the nation.
And even the Emancipation Proclamation, a huge step, but limited in scope and driven by strategy, too.
Not just this pure moral act, a calculated move in a larger power struggle.
Right. Zinn wants us to understand this complexity. Historical events, they're rarely black and white, full of nuance, different motivations, unintended consequences.
And even after the war ended, racial equality was far from over.
Reconstruction. A brief moment of hope, then betrayal. Jim Crow laws, the Ku Klux Klan, the systematic disenfranchisement of black people. Fragile progress.
Showing how those in power can reverse gains if they want to maintain the status quo. And this leads us to the late 19th century, the rise of industrial capitalism.
Immense wealth for a few, but a new wave of exploitation, labor struggles. Zinn depicts this vividly.
Robber barons getting rich while workers toiled in dangerous conditions, making little money. It's Dickensian almost, isn't it?
It is. And Zinn brings it to life through the workers' stories. They risk everything to fight for better conditions.
Like the Homestead strike, steel workers versus Pinkerton detectives hired by Andrew Carnegie shows how far corporations would go to crush labor movements.
And this wasn't isolated. Zinn takes us from the coal mines to the railroads, showing us how workers were organizing, resisting.
It's inspiring, right? Even against such power, they fought back. And as we move into the 20th century, this fight for economic justice, it continues.
The Socialist Party gained a lot of support in the early 1900s.
Interesting to think about how socialist ideas, often demonized today, were once a powerful force in American politics.
Zinn reminds us that this wasn't just some abstract debate. It was rooted in the struggles of working people.
He talks about the Lawrence textile strike, immigrant workers, many women striking for better wages, working conditions.
What's key here is solidarity. Workers from different backgrounds, different languages coming together.
And they won. It shows what collective action can achieve, and this spirit of resistance carries on throughout the century.
The Civil Rights Movement. Zinn sees it not just as racial equality, but economic justice, too.
He reminds us that Martin Luther King Jr. was very critical of poverty, economic inequality.
Exactly. His vision went beyond just desegregation. And Zinn connects the civil rights movement to other movements, anti-war, women's rights, environmental ends, all pushing for a just society. And these movements, they didn't just appear out of nowhere.
They were built on the struggles of those who came before, workers, abolitionists, suffragists.
It's this continuity, history as a living process, that makes Zinn's work so compelling. The fight for justice is never truly over.
And that's an important message, right? Especially when we're bombarded with news that can make us feel powerless. Zinn reminds us change is possible, but it takes engagement, organizing, hope. Back again for more of our deep dive into a people's history. This time, we're really getting into the 20th century, a century of huge shifts, social and political.
Yeah, as we get closer to our own time, Zinn looks at how the end of the Cold War it brought about new challenges, especially economically.
One thing that hit me was his discussion of globalization. It was supposed to level the playing field, but Zinn argues it actually led to outsourcing, more wealth concentrated in the hands of a few. Did we just trade the robber barons of the past for these giant global corporations?
It does make you think, doesn't it? And Zinn connects it to real people, the folks actually impacted by these shifts.
He talks about NAFTA, for example, supposed to be this big win-win for the U.S., Mexico, Canada. But the reality wasn't so simple.
Zinn highlights how NAFTA led to, well, millions of workers losing their jobs, both in the U.S. and Mexico. Factories closing, communities devastated.
It wasn't just NAFTA either. He also talks about the rise of the anti-globalization movement, late 90s, early 2000s.
Those protests, often targeting the World Trade Organization, they brought together activists globally.
Global solidarity, people recognizing these issues go beyond borders.
Challenging the whole structure of global trade, saying it was undemocratic, harmful to workers and the environment.
It really speaks to Zinn's point that economic justice is, well, it's an ongoing struggle.
Absolutely. Not some battle won or lost ages ago. It's happening now.
Shifting gears a bit, Zinn also digs into the war on terror. After 9/11. A tough chapter, emotionally and intellectually.
He argues that, well, the attacks were horrific, obviously, but they were used to justify a massive increase in military power and, a rollback of civil liberties.
He's really critical of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, saying they were based on weak justifications and caused huge suffering.
And beyond the wars themselves, Zinn talks about the surveillance state, the Patriot Act, the NSA collecting all that data, eroding privacy, undermining democratic values.
It's kind of chilling how easily governments can expand their power in the name of security. Where's the line between safety and sacrificing our freedoms?
That's a question Zinn keeps coming back to.
Yeah.
He wants us to think about power, the role of government, individual liberty.
It's what makes a people's history relevant today. It's a way to understand not just past events, but the challenges we face now.
It's a guide to thinking about power, resistance, this constant fight for social justice.
Let's step back for a minute, though, back to the early 20th century. The rise of industrial capitalism, all the labor struggles that came with it.
Those powerful industrialists, Carnegie, Rockefeller, amassing fortunes while workers faced dangerous factories, low wages.
Classic exploitation. And it feels relevant, doesn't it? We're still talking about income inequality, workers' rights, corporate power.
Exactly. Zinn's not just talking about ancient history. These are 21st century issues, too.
He talks about the Homestead Strike, that violent clash between steel workers and those Pinkerton detectives hired by Carnegie.
A turning point in American labor history. Shows how far corporations would go to stop unions, protect their profits.
It wasn't just Homestead either. The Pullman Strike, the Ludlow Massacre, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, each one showing the brutal side of capitalism.
And they fueled the labor movement. Zinn argues they were key to getting things like workplace safety rules, minimum wage laws, things we take for granted now.
A reminder that the rights we have, they weren't just given to us, they were fought for.
Hard one, absolutely. And this fight for economic justice, Zinn shows how it's tied to racial equality, too.
He says the civil rights movement wasn't just about desegregation. It was about economic disparities that impacted Black Americans.
He talks about Martin Luther King Jr.'s Poor People's Campaign, bringing together poor folks of all races to fight for economic justice.
Powerful vision, recognizing how race and class intersect.
And still relevant. Mass incarceration, police brutality, the racial wealth gap.
Zinn helps us see these not as isolated events, but as part of this bigger historical pattern, oppression and resistance.
He reminds us, the fight for a just society, it's a marathon. You need vigilance, sustained effort, and to challenge those in power.
So moving deeper into the 20th century, Zinn looks at how America's involvement in global conflicts, especially Vietnam, triggered huge protests, dissent.
Yeah, the anti-war movement. It drew in all kinds of people, students, veterans, religious leaders, artists, just regular
They
folks.
weren't just against the war itself, they were challenging like the whole foundation of American foreign policy.
And there was resistance within the military, too. Soldiers who refused to fight, those who deserted to Canada, veterans who came home and spoke out against the war.
Showing that dissent can come from anywhere.
Exactly. And Zinn shows how this wasn't just a fringe group. It impacted public opinion and helped lead to the U.S. pulling out of Vietnam.
The power of organized resistance, speaking truth to power.
Absolutely.
And along with the anti-war movement, Zinn explores second-wave feminism, the 60s and 70s, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, challenging those traditional roles for women.
That book resonated with so many women who felt trapped. It helped spark a movement demanding equal rights, education, work, reproductive rights, political representation.
Zinn talks about the National Organization for Women, NOW, a major force in the fight for equality. It's fascinating how these movements for change often happen side by side.
Feeding off each other, this sense of shared purpose. And Zinn emphasizes that connection. True liberation means dismantling all systems of oppression. Race, gender, class, sexual orientation, solidarity is key to real change.
And getting into the later decades of the century, Zinn doesn't avoid the tougher stuff, the Watergate scandal.
Exposing all that corruption in the Nixon administration.
Zinn argues that while Watergate was a shock, it wasn't unique. It was part of a bigger pattern. Government secrecy, deception, disregard for the law.
He wants us to question authority, hold them accountable.
He also talks about the Attica prison uprising, prisoners versus guards. It really highlighted those brutal conditions in the prison system.
Zinn presents it as resistance against a dehumanizing system. It makes us think about punishment, incarceration, the need for prison reform.
And it's not just prisons. Zinn looks at Native Americans who continued to face discrimination, poverty, loss of their cultural heritage.
The American Indian Movement, AM, demanding more autonomy for Native American tribes.
Their activism, often confrontational, brought attention to the issues they face, challenged those government policies of assimilation, forced relocation.
It's a reminder that the fight for justice has many sides. There are always new battles, new challenges, new voices.
And Zinn wants us to listen to those voices, learn from the past, be active in shaping a more just future. He believed history isn't just something we read about, it's something we make through our actions.
And that's empowering, especially when things feel, overwhelming. Zinn reminds us, change is possible, but we have to be informed, engaged.
He wants us to be more than just readers of history. We should be its authors, writing our own stories of resistance and change.
I love that.
So as we wrap up part 2, I'm curious, what are you thinking out there, dear listener? What connections are you making between these events and today's world? What surprised you? Challenged your views? We'll be back soon for part 3, where we'll look at Zinn's legacy and the lasting impact of people's history. All right, welcome back to our deep dive into Howard Zinn's A People's History. As we wrap up, I'm really thinking about what makes this book stick with you. Why does it still resonate so much all these years later?
One thing that's so clear from A People's History is that the fight for social justice, it runs through all of American history. It's not like a straight line of progress. It's more like waves, ups and downs, Victories and setbacks, ordinary people pushing back against power, against oppression.
Zinn's work is powerful because he doesn't shy away from the tough stuff, the things we might not want to face. The genocide of Native Americans, the brutality of slavery, exploitation of workers, silencing dissent. He lays it all out there.
And yet, even with all that, he shows us the resilience of people, those who've been marginalized, oppressed. Even when the odds are stacked against them, they find ways to fight back, to organize, to demand something better.
One thing that really hit me was how he reframes the American Revolution. It's not just that simple story of everyone uniting against tyranny, is it?
He's saying, yeah, the talk of liberty and equality, that was powerful. But it often hid the reality, the class divisions, the different agendas. A lot of colonists weren't so eager to rebel, not because they loved the king, but because they didn't see how independence would help them. Poverty, land disputes, economic exploitation, they were dealing with all that.
So it was as much about internal power struggles as it was about breaking free from England.
Exactly. And Zinn suggests those colonial elites, they were pretty savvy, using the language of freedom, democracy, to get support for a revolution that, well, in the end, benefited them.
Makes you wonder, how many times has that happened? Those in power using popular movements for their own gain.
It's a pattern Zinn points out throughout the book, like with westward expansion, manifest destiny.
Mm.
this noble idea. But it was really about taking land from Native Americans, from Mexicans.
And the Civil War, too. Yes, it was about slavery, but also tied to the economic goals of northern industrialists.
Zinn makes us look past the simple stories, the ones we're told. We have to grapple with power, with motives, with how history actually changes. It's a challenge, but it's eye-opening.
It's like once you see those patterns, you can't unsee them. You start questioning everything.
Right. That's why a people's history is so important. It pushes us to think critically, question those dominant narratives, see the people who are often erased from the story.
And I think that's why so many people, especially young people, are drawn to it today. They want a more honest, more nuanced view of history.
It gives you a framework for understanding not just the past, but the things we're dealing with now. It's all connected to these different struggles, this fight for justice that never really ends.
He shows us that history isn't just some fixed thing set in stone. It's alive, it's changing, and we're all part of it. We have the power to shape it.
That's a powerful message, especially when the world can feel so messed up. Zinn reminds us that change is possible, but we have to be informed. We have to get involved.
He doesn't want us to just read about history. He wants us to make it, to write our own stories of resistance, of change.
That's beautiful.
So as we wrap up our deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought from Howard Zinn himself. Our future may depend on our ability to face a terrible truth, that the history of our nation is a history of racism, violence, and injustice. But it's also a history of courage, resilience, of people striving for a better world. Let's learn from the past, engage with the present, and build a future that's worthy of everyone.
Beautifully put. And thank you for joining us on this exploration of a people's history. We hope it's made you curious, made you question some things, and maybe inspired you to keep digging into those hidden stories that shape our world.